On this episode of the show, I have with me Ashley Utz. She is the Chief People Officer at Happy Money, and we're going to be talking about recovering and rebuilding trust within an organization. Obviously, the last couple of years, we've seen a little bit of a bumpy road, and we're going to talk to Ashley about how she navigates this market, this state that we're currently seeing. How does she actually set the context to talk about this stuff with the team? And we're going to talk about how she actually goes about looking at rebuilding it, reestablishing that trust, bringing in potentially new leaders that also have to work within that framework. Ashley, I'm excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, great to be here. I'm excited. It's a big topic for sure and an important one right now.
Yes, it is. Before we start, can you tell everyone what Happy Money does?
Yeah, Happy Money is a financial technology company, and our whole purpose is to improve folks' financial lives, specifically in the personal lending space. So, taking folks that have high credit card debt and are looking to consolidate that into a personal loan with more reasonable terms, really helping build some financial wellness for America.
Absolutely. So this episode, we're going to be talking about, obviously, we've seen, companies have layoffs. We've seen contraction, slower hiring. Obviously, a lot of different things can be causing that. And sometimes companies have to pivot and, reestablish what they want to do and how they want to operate. All those things are a challenge for a chief people officer. I guess, when we are looking at a company and we're looking at a situation that isn't necessarily favorable, right? Organizations aren't immune to these situations. That context has to be key in explaining it to the organization.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. And even to take a step back, I think it's important to understand the context is bigger than only the organization you're in, right? So trust in institutions in general is at an all-time low. Edelman Trust Barometer just released something in 2025. 61% of people believe that business and government are making life worse, not better. That's astounding, right? And to take it to an organizational level, Gartner released a study last year. 49% of employees don't trust their organization, 48% don't trust their senior leadership, and 44% don't trust HR. All of those are heartbreaking for me, especially the last one. But organizations aren't immune to this. And so every time you open your Instagram feed or you turn on the news, folks are inundated with some of the societal polarization and the uncertainty. And this institutional disrupt shapes how people experience work. And specifically, as you mentioned, organizational cycles are very real. So layoffs and restructures, you have acquisitions and divestitures, leadership changes, they're common and a lot of times necessary, but they leave trust fractured. And there's some things we can talk about that are best practices that can help, but we should assume we're starting from a place of trust deficit. So as we think about building trust, we really have to operate from that assumption.
I guess a question for you, when we do talk about trust, you have to have the pillar. Do you have to have the pillars in place? Because obviously when we're talking about these, especially the last couple of years where we have seen some of the issues you've mentioned come to light. I mean, they've happened in previous cycles. So I think we go through these lulls of forgetting and then we remember and then, rinse and repeat. But the pillar of trust, I guess, talk to us a little bit about how that affects this context. If you have really high trust within the organization, within these teams you've mentioned versus you're already on shaky grounds, I mean, that's got to make a difference.
Yeah, it does. But I think you have to start with even defining what trust is.
Sure.
So in order to know if you have high trust or low trust, we have to take a second and think about what is trust? And so one of the things I wrestle with often is organizational trust is very different than personal trust, right? So organizational trust may be built on things like clarity and consistency, communication, right? You might define those as things that really breed high trust in organizations and for your employees and for your team. But personal trust is a bit different, right? It's built more on vulnerability or emotional intimacy. And organizations have to wrestle with this paradox of transparency, for lack of better words. So Like oversharing too often can backfire because things change regularly. And trust isn't always about telling everything. There's these radical transparency concepts that have kind of caught on, especially, in the startup world. And taken out of context, that can be kind of a dangerous phrase, because radical transparency, or being transparent to build trust, should be focused on sharing what matters when it matters in a transparent way. It doesn't necessarily mean sharing everything. An exercise I sometimes do, if you'd humor me, is just take a moment, and I'd encourage our listeners to do this as well. Take a moment and reflect and think of the top 5 people you trust most in your life. And think about why you trust them. So if you've got your 5, now narrow that down to your top 1 or 2. And I know this is hard because I'm sure you are a very trustworthy person, right? I'm sure listeners are very trustworthy people and they have a lot of trusted loved ones in their life, but pick 1 or 2 if you can't pick 1. And think about what makes them stand out. So I don't know about for you, but for me, that's my spouse. I trust him. I know he'll always choose me. It's a deep, unconditional trust. We've built it together over 15 years of deep personal connection, but it's not necessarily fair. But I don't want it to be fair, right? He likely over-indexes to my needs, perhaps more than our kids, other loved ones. For lack of better words, like, I'm his favorite person, or at least I hope so. But that is very different than organizational trust. Like, can that kind of trust exist in an organization? Should it exist in an organization? I don't know. I'd be curious your thoughts, but I think probably not. And I think that's okay, because you want high trust in organizations to be built on things like clarity and consistency and respect. And there's this piece of fairness that I think is really important to people. And that's very different than how we think about trust in our deep personal relationships, right?
Absolutely. It's something, and I think everything you said absolutely resonates and makes sense. When we do think about the organization, obviously there is a balance. You work for a company. They pay for your services. There's a mutual understanding and cooperation. Both sides understand that there's also a very thin bond. As strong as that bond might be, it's a thin bond, because you could actually get fired and or leave. I mean,
Yeah.
When you look at trust and you're trying to factor that into the organization, some of the characteristics you mentioned about trust in our daily lives and whether trust could be mirrored like that in an organization, there's obviously different ingredients to that. There's different dimensions that make up that trust. What are some of the factors that within an organization you need to establish and have a level of trust?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wheel when you've got really good researchers out there. So, an article, a book, someone I follow often is Stephen Covey and his speed of trust model. So I'll do my best to kind of summarize that for you, but I leverage that as a way to really define trust. So Stephen Covey really breaks this into 2 components. You have character trust and competence trust. And you really need both in an organization to create a high trust environment. So character trust are things like integrity and honesty, intent, right? I say what I'm going to do, then I do that thing, right? In competence, it's things like capability and results and follow through. So I'm good at my job. You can count on me to know what I'm supposed to know, and you can count on me to execute my goals. You really need both in leadership. You also need both in your teams, every level of the organization. You can probably think of times where you've worked with folks that were really kind, whether they were on your team or a leader. But if they don't follow through, you're frustrated. Just because they're kind doesn't mean you trust them, right? And similarly, you've probably worked with folks that really know their job well. They know their area of expertise. They do follow through, but they don't have integrity, right? And you don't trust them. You're skeptical then. So you can kind of see how that model does a nice job of describing this character and competence piece. The best leaders I know, they're not just good people, they're good at their jobs too. And one doesn't really work without the other.
That's actually very well said, and I actually do agree with you because I think you do see those different types of personalities, and you do need a balance. And I guess when we're talking about trust within an organization, I guess the challenge is, and we see it a lot with values. We see that people are trying to do top-down driven, statements of value, but really, to me, I always believe it's bottom up because people have to embody the value so that the actual value could be portrayed and represented within the company, throughout the company. When we talk about trust, is it top down? Is it bottom up? Because I think it sounds like, there might be a middle part to this because obviously trust doesn't exist within the organization itself. It's the people.
Yeah, I think it's a both and. I think it's bottom up, I think it's top down, and I think where it gets really messy, but where it really breeds high trust is in the middle. So I think of it as there are times where leaders, organizations need to be very clear about their values, and that may feel very top down. I think in those instances, it's okay and even important to be direct because folks can choose whether that's the right place for them, then, right? That's an important ingredient. They can choose to opt in or opt out. So let's assume you do that and folks opt in. I think the bottom up feedback is really important to understand. How do those values come to life? What are people worried about? What are they afraid of? And it takes courage from the folks in the other levels of the organization to raise those right issues and have those right conversations to make those things come to life. And the other piece is, I think sometimes we just need to sit with that tension a bit, right? Whether it's a bottom up initiative or a top down initiative, there's bound to be some tension. But if you really enable that and invite people into that with you, let them sit in that messy middle a bit. There's this like interesting power dynamic that sometimes comes out when you talk about organization and employees, right? Like one is on top and one is on the bottom. In some ways that's right. There's hierarchy that exists, there's decision authority, etc. But we have to remind ourselves that like employees are adults, right? And they're very good at their jobs. All of us want to be honored in the work that we do. And the best solution typically and the best way to build trust is to listen and have courage on both sides, right? Leaders and employees alike have to really step into that middle together.
Absolutely. As we're talking about trust, and I think some of what we were going to cover, and I think it's very important, is when you're at an organization that there is shifts. It could be positive, could be negative. It doesn't matter. I think shifts typically put an imbalance, introduces a variable within the organization, potentially anxiety, as you mentioned, frustration, skepticism are not necessarily healthy things for trust. When we are in these situations where things aren't going well, and as you said, times have changed, I guess how do you make sure, or how do you focus on articulating the right things? Because you also said we don't necessarily have to articulate everything, but message and articulate the right things to ensure people trust you, but they're also feeling that there is transparency for them to be effective in understanding and in the know.
Yeah, it's a great point. Listen, layoffs and restructures happen. It is, I would argue, probably one of the most challenging trust breaking situations to navigate. I also think there are some best practices you can utilize, but you should, again, assume you're operating from a trust deficit. And these things will take organizations and folks time to repair from, right? I think there should just be a baseline assumption there. Some of the best practices I think about, though, are being transparent about the why. As I mentioned, employees are smart, they're adults, they understand how businesses work. A lot of times being transparent about the why, even if they don't agree with it, even if it doesn't take away the pain that a layoff can bring, it's an important place to start, right? So ground with the why always. The other is treat people with dignity. Um, Honor folks on their way out if you can. These are likely people who have given a lot to organizations. Celebrate that, celebrate them and do what you can to support them in whatever's next. The other is making sure you follow through on promises, and maybe more importantly, be careful what you promise. When we think about trust breaking situations, a lot of times leaders with really good intent will say something or promise something that just ends up not being able to happen. You just can't deliver it for whatever reason. So follow through on the promises you make. Be very careful about the promises you make. And then the other, and maybe most important, is acknowledging the impact. Again, it doesn't take away the tough situation, but just acknowledging the humanity in some of these changes is really important. It helps people feel seen and respected, even if it's not the outcome that they would have personally liked for themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. I guess when it comes to the communication aspect, obviously we talked about, top down, bottom up, managers play an important part in the middle there. I guess sometimes we kind of have things come top down and we leave it further and further, depending on the size of the org. The bigger the org, we leave it more and more to the discretion of various levels of management to deliver certain types of news or talk about certain things. Is that, I guess, I don't know if that helps or hurts. Because obviously every team, a manager knows their team differently. So I understand that. But the messaging and what we just talked about, how you message, the amount you share, every person will get into that uncomfortable bit. Some people are over talkers. Some people are, go into a shell and say little. How does that, when we're talking about making sure we're communicating things correctly, how does that play out? How do you think we can improve that?
Yeah, you're spot on. It can help or hurt, right? Leaders can help or hurt in these situations. It really just depends. I know that's a total HR answer, but I think it depends on the situation. A few things I think about though. So, let's consider if this is like a large scale change, right? There are probably some key things you want the organizational or senior leadership team voice behind, right? That that would be good moments to pull an entire group together. Let's say you have a big acquisition or a big divestiture and you want to announce that to the organization all at once. Pull the team together, share the key points, be very crisp on your why. Then I think there's a place for leaders to translate that into what matters most for the different folks on their team. And the truth is, people trust people. They don't trust institutions, right? They trust people. And managers are those day-to-day trust builders. And so if we can equip leaders to really lead with clarity and consistency and care, there can be a big difference there. I mean, think about if you're going through a major organizational shift like an acquisition, announcing that to a new employee who started a week ago versus a director in the organization who maybe is closer to the strategy, or a 10-year veteran who works in your customer contact center and is answering the phones every day. Each of those experiences are going to be uniquely different. How they interpret that information is going to be uniquely different. And so that's where you need your leaders to really step up and know their teams. And you also are going to get more candid conversation. In a big all-employee, town hall setting, you may not get some of that engagement and those tough questions that are really important. Chances are, hopefully, your employees feel comfortable saying some of those things to their managers or to each other in a way that they wouldn't in a large group setting. So long-winded way to say, I think trust is critical, and we need to remind ourselves that people trust people at the end of the day. And the more we can personalize some of those messages, I think the better off we are in the long term.
That's fantastic. I think that's very well said. And I want to say thank you for coming on to talk about the topic. I know, it's actually very timely. And actually everything you mentioned hopefully will be evergreen, because I think is relevant even when we have good times and there's change. So I think this is a very good topic. Obviously, we have not exhausted the conversation nor your experience. If somebody does want to reach out to you to ask you a follow-up question, what's a good way of doing that?
They can certainly find me on LinkedIn. I have to admit, I'm very behind on my messages on LinkedIn, but I'd still love to connect and hear from you. So certainly, Ashley Utz, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to connect. And maybe just to leave folks with one final reflection or thought, I think just a reminder that trust is quiet. It's really earned in the little things, lost in the gaps, and then really rebuilt through action. It's really not about being perfect. But it is about being worthy. So hopefully we can all strive to do a little better there.
Absolutely. I love it. Ashley, thanks for taking the time. Thanks for coming on and sharing with us.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That's it for the episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think Ashley, we covered a great topic. She had great perspective, insights, and I think she provided some fantastic stories in there as well, and some things to look out for. I think there was an exercise that we can all do about who we trust and why we trust them. So please share this episode with somebody else who might benefit from it. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.